Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to cover a few important topics regarding the social aspect of emergency preparedness that came to mind recently when someone attempted to insult me on the internet by using the word prepper. Alright, this was despite me barely ever even talking about prepping and not even identifying as a prepper. So is prepping bad? Why do some people use prepper as an insult? Is prepper necessarily a paranoid doomsday prepper or a right-wing gun nut? All this and more if you pay attention for the next few minutes. As many of you know, I helped to start 2 intentional communities in Ecuador that are centered around growing fruit, living sustainably off the land, and having a positive effect on the planet, among other things. Recently, one of our occasional critics made an accusation that we were a community of right-wing nutjobs who loved guns, and that we were a community of doomsday preppers. Now, of course, the first part isn't true, as any of the hundreds of people who have been here can attest to. So I'll respond to the bit about the doomsday preppers. First, I want to observe how telling it is that the left now uses prepper as an insult. This is a lot different than when I was a kid. Sure, there has always been a concerted effort in the media to paint people who prepare for natural and societal disasters as loonies, and I'm sure some of them are, but the idea of being prepared for a disaster didn't used to be considered such a bad thing. It didn't used to be vilified. It didn't used to be an insult. I remember learning about emergency preparation when I was a Boy Scout. We had an emergency preparedness merit badge. They taught that every family should have a disaster plan, a first aid kit, a supply of non-perishable food, and a supply of potable water for every person in the family. Hurricanes, tornadoes, power outages, supply chain issues, and even wars can severely disrupt your life or even kill you if you are not properly prepared for such an emergency. Obviously, this critic of ours had drunk the Kool-Aid and was totally against the idea of being prepared for emergencies. To see people using prepper as an insult in such a way might cause those of you with 3-digit IQs to wonder why the rich elites and the fascist powers that be spent so much money brainwashing those of you with 2-digit IQs that being prepared for emergencies was bad. Why is such a concerted effort by the media? We've seen the cute media reports showing these crazy preppers and their underground bunkers and the denigrating comments in the media about the right-wing nutters and their doomsday theories. All this goes to convince the average person that expecting the best but preparing for the worst makes you some kind of enemy. I'm going to lay it right out in front of you. Many government elites want you to be dependent on the government in times of emergency. This gives them more control, and even gives them the option of obtaining instant control by initiating an emergency if it suited their needs at the time. I'm not saying they would ever do that. Maybe they've already done that. Rather than staying in your home and living off your 30-day supply of perishables and water, they want to be able to truck you off to a FEMA camp right away. Rather than people being self-sufficient and not needing the government so much, they want people to be ill-prepared, so they are desperate for the government's assistance, which is often poorly administered and ripe with corruption and graft, just like any other government program. See what happened in Haiti for a great example. All of this is just another way to increase demand for government services. Imagine doctors advising against healthy diets, not giving any nutrition advice, so that your future need for expensive medical intervention and surgeries is greatly increased. Actually, this already happens. And it's the same principle, the same modus operandi. Now you might say to yourself, Peter is crazy. This is just a conspiracy theory. The US government wants to help people. There is no big conspiracy to turn prepper into an insult in the lexicon of the common folk, thus encouraging people to stay perpetually ill-prepared and dependent on the Federal Emergency Management Agency to take care of them in times of crisis. That sounds like something that an evil third world dictatorship would do, but never in the United States of America, right? Okay, I get it. My claim is a bit out there. And I need to support it with some actual evidence. What would I need to show in order to give my claim more validity? Well, I'm not going to give you a 2-hour expose because I'm not trying to convince the people who could never be convinced anyways, the Kool-Aid-aholics. But for the rest of you, it would be helpful if I could show some evidence that the U.S. federal government has decreased its recommendations for survival preparation. And I have that evidence straight from the horse's mouth. Let's head on over to ready.gov, the official citizen emergency preparedness propaganda website of the Department of Homeland Security. Remember, the government itself recommends that everyone should be a prepper, but only a certain amount. According to some people, you should only prep up to the government-approved amount of prepping, after which your preparedness is considered worthy of petty insults. By the way, the first Google suggested result when I typed in prepping how much with the anticipation of typing in how much food was actually prepping how much ammo. That seems to be one of the last things people will consider, which makes me think that perhaps it is a result purposefully ranked by Google to subliminally remind people that preppers are just crazy gun nuts rather than normal people interested in being prepared for emergencies. You go to search for one of the most common sensible aspects of prepping, and you are instantly reminded of one of the supposedly crazy aspects of prepping that the media says is bad and evil. Subliminal to those of you who are still high on Kool-Aid, but obvious to those of us who are suspicious observers. Defending yourself against criminals is important, but food and water are 10 times more important. So, right away on the ready.gov page, they are telling us to make a plan. Notice how this plan is all about finding immediate shelter and then evacuation, of course, to a government-approved and administered facility. Nothing about storing food or water or other supplies. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you will find that they recommend a 3-day supply of food. 3 days is a bit of a gamble. That's barely enough time to survive until the trucks come along to ship you off to the FEMA shelter. That's what they want. And interestingly enough, the header image is of a lady in a well-stocked grocery store, presumably purchasing non-perishable foods in the canned food aisle, with a uniformed military man. It's kind of a weird juxtaposition. Perhaps it is just her son and he happens to be in the military, or maybe it is to signify the government helping people prepare. But if you're not paying attention, this image really puts into your head the idea of the military, not just the government, but the military being an essential component in your disaster survival, as opposed to, neighbors, community, local relief and emergency organizations, and nonprofits. Of course, if FEMA doesn't respond in time and leaves people stranded, or if the same thing happens with the equivalent government agency in whatever country you happen to live in, you're screwed. But they don't care if you're screwed. They only care that if you do survive, you are dependent on the government for your survival. From a market perspective, they are increasing demand for their services and thus ensuring their continued existence and expansion by ensuring that you do not have any alternative to their services. Let's head on over to the U.S. Center for Disease Control, the CDC website, where they also talk about preparing for natural disasters and severe weather. They too recommend a 3-day supply of food. So as for water, the CDC recommends a 3-day supply of water. And they say, or a 2-week supply, but only if possible, right? Water is the most important thing. You can survive on fasting and rationing food for a while, or even roasting the inner cambium layer of tree bark. But without clean drinking water, you get dehydrated or you get cholera and you die. And they are still recommending storing just barely enough to keep you alive until you desperately seek out the nearest government-administered shelter. Now, I've established that the current government recommendations in the United States are that you should stock a measly 3-day supply of food and water, leaving you at the mercy of the competency of FEMA if and when a disaster should strike. Well, let's look back a few years and see what they used to recommend. I dug up this old PDF publication from FEMA called Food and Water in an Emergency. That's very direct, very clear. It was published in 2004, 16 years ago. It starts out much more dire than the current websites of the government. It says, if a disaster strikes your community, you might not have access to food or water for days or even weeks. This is a very powerful message, touching on people's natural instincts to protect their families. It's set with a dramatic backdrop and coloring. They specifically recommend that you should store enough food for 2 weeks. So this is clear evidence that 16 years ago, the same exact organization recommended 2 weeks of food storage, and now in 2020, they only recommend 3 days, right? Why the change? I suggest nefarious intentions. Let's look back even further. In the Cold War era, though I was unable to get an exact date on the release of this U.S. government civil defense video, it was also recommended that families store 2 weeks of food and water. Of course, before the 1950s and before World War II, the majority of American households actually grew a lot of their own food. So back then, there weren't really such emergency recommendations. If there were a disaster, it wouldn't matter because people grew their own food anyways. So anyways, at least since the 1960s, when it became necessary, they recommended 2 weeks of emergency food and water prepping, and now they only recommend 3 days. I provided the evidence that I said I would provide, that the government severely decreased its official recommendations on how much food and water families should store to prepare for emergencies. Will you now believe me that some very evil people are trying to make you woefully unprepared for the next natural disaster or civil emergency? So what about those old recommendations? They are indeed more sensible than 3 days, but is 2 weeks even enough? I think 2 weeks is more realistic than 1 to 2 months for many people on a low income. But it could still be considered just enough time for FEMA to come get you, which doesn't solve the problem that we have many populations all around the world that even if they do follow those guidelines, they're still wholly reliant on the government, on their government to help them. Why can't communities be more resilient and self-sufficient? Why don't governments recommend that neighbors get together, form emergency plans, grow more of their own food, and store more non-perishables and other important supplies? This would greatly reduce government expenditures in times of crisis, and it would in fact result in less fatalities due to emergency workers not reaching people in time. But it would also greatly reduce the number of people dependent on government. And I think dependency and the resultant control is their true goal. I can think of many natural disasters in many countries where after 2 or 3 months, the people in the affected areas are still living in makeshift tents with little food or water. People who live in first world countries tend to assume this would never happen to them because the government has their back. But once their 3-day supply of canned bean runs out, the FEMA trucks will come along. Sometimes governments fail, sometimes first world governments act more like third world governments when a real crisis hits. If the big one ever hits the California coast, do you really think FEMA will be able to evacuate all of you within 3 days? Preppers aren't as crazy as the propaganda machine would have you believe. They're mostly just sensible, realistic people who want to be able to protect themselves and their families in times of crisis. There are many survival prep blogs. Some of them read like post-apocalyptic fictions. Some are indeed the doomsday-obsessed gun enthusiasts that all preppers are stereotyped as, and some are pretty sensible compilations of preparedness advice. Many recommend 2 to 3 months or more of non-perishable food and water storage. Here in Ecuador, in October 2019, we are affected by a roughly 2-week crisis in which almost all major roads in the country were shut down by a national protest. College students were protesting that the government wasn't as socialist as they wanted it to be, and impoverished people were protesting that fuel subsidies were cut, so they had to pay the same price for fuel as most other countries in Latin America. Oh, what a horrible injustice. Also, they were somewhat protesting the recent IMF loans to the national government. But that was a side issue, as the fuel subsidies were what actually sparked the protest, and their reinstatement was the main demand of the protesters. In the end, they wanted the government to continue to spend as much money as it was spending, but without taking on any foreign loans or IMF loans, which was impossible. They claimed they would present alternative solutions for getting the national budget under control without taking on these loans, but of course none of these solutions actually make a dent into the budget. It's just wishful thinking. They were, in typical brainwashed pleb fashion, using the word austerity as if it were a dirty word. Really, it just means the government not giving you as much free stuff with stolen money as it did last year. On the one hand, they complain that the Ecuadorian government is exploiting the mineral resources, causing environmental destruction. On the other hand, they complain that the government is not spending enough money on providing them with free stuff, which of course it would never be able to afford without the mineral extraction. I'm not in any way pro-mining or pro-oil drilling, obviously, but I think cutting government spending so it isn't tempted to do all those bad things for revenue is a win-win situation. People will learn to provide for themselves without government handouts, just as they did before the government handouts. But anyways, though you could still get food and water during this 2-week crisis, most stores were not stocked. Propane and gasoline were impossible to get almost anywhere, and the country was at a standstill. The tourism industry took a huge hit. People were eating very basic items, harvesting whatever they could find from their land, or paying large bribes at violent indigenous roadblocks to get into towns that were still, somewhat stocked. Fortunately, living on a permaculture farm, my friends and I had plenty of food to harvest, but even so, we were not quite prepared to deal with such an event. Now we know to make some changes in our storing of fuels and supplies, our crop selection, and our growing practices, so if something like that happens again, we will barely notice. At our community of frugivorous, environmentalist, freedom-loving permaculture enthusiasts in southeast Ecuador, we are proud to be preppers. It is a compliment, not an insult. We will continue to prepare for whatever may come, regardless of what the mainstream media and its army of Kool-Aid enthusiasts has to say about us. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe to my channel and check out fruithavenecovillage.com and terrafruitus.com. And be sure to come hang out with us next year at the Amazon Fruit Festival 2021, our third such festival. The dates will be announced on AmazonFruitFestival.com in February 2020.